Liu Bang was a peasant-born scoundrel, a scamp, who cheated, lied, and conned his way into becoming the first emperor of the Han Dynasty, one of China's golden ages. He rose to power by outwitting probably one of the mightiest warlords ancient China had ever seen, Xiang Yu. At the risk of sounding controversial, yeah, Xiang Yu was probably even stronger than the legendary Lu Bu. But just as Liu Bang thought that he had overcome the greatest challenge of his life, and he can now kick back and relax, enter Modu Shanyu and his Xiongnu Empire. Now, with China once again united under one rule, can these steppe nomads provide any challenge at all? Well, let's find out. So, who were the Xiongnu? Since the dawn of Chinese history, during the pre-imperial dynasties of Xia, Shang, and Zhou, the various nomadic tribes around the ancient borders of China had been the silent players in ancient Chinese politics. They not only raided and traded with the various Chinese states, they often allied and worked as mercenaries for them too. Various names were used for them: Western Rong, Northern Di, and by the Warring States period, the generic term Hu was used for these nomads. Obviously, the groups within this category consisted of separate tribes and federations. But who the heck did surveys back then? So they just slapped the same label on all of them and called it a day. But by the time Qin Shi Huang had conquered the 6 states and united China, the group called Xiongnu had become a significant enough threat to warrant a distinct name. However, they had existed much further back than this, of course, with a long line of Shanyus before Toman, the leader of the period. So in 215 BCE, Qin Shi Huang dispatched an army led by General Meng Tian, and he successfully drove them northwards. Following the victory, the Qin army connected the Great Walls and told the Xiongnu to stay out. Well, the Qin army was just too strong at the time, and with Meng Tian guarding the frontiers, they decided to turn their attention to their old rivalries with the Yuezhi and the Donghu instead. Contrary to common beliefs, the steppe nomads' greatest enemies were not the agrarian people they raid. Most of the time, these agriculturalists are at the mercy of the steppe nomads and their highly mobile raiding tactics. Meng Tian's victory was only possible through concerted efforts and the highly militarized Qin imperial policy, and that didn't happen too often throughout ancient history. Their real competitors were in fact other steppe nomads. The politics of the steppe is actually quite interesting. I think we should start looking into this by asking the question, why do steppe nomads raid? Hey, you know what day it is? Friday. Why? Oh, it's Raiding Day! Let's raid! No, the steppe nomads like the Xiongnu, Scythian, and the Huns don't raid just because. These pastoralists have their livestock, and they can live a decent life sustained by their animals. Agricultural products are not an important part of their diet. And if they want to get some grains and veg, they can do it easily and peacefully, just by trading. But things get interesting when certain tribes and strongmen started to get ambitious. Loots acquired from raiding are prime political currency in their gift economy. Leaders gain political clout and attract other tribes into their confederacy by displaying their generosity and showering their followers with gifts. And a quick way to acquire these gifts that they can dole out is obviously through raiding. But the impulse to raid does not necessarily go just one top-down direction. It can go bottom-up when the poorer members of the society or those affected by the pressure of climate change petition their leader to go raiding. So fluctuations in the climate and environmental changes can be a determining factor in their activity. This is why these nomadic steppe empires often prefer to raid and extort their settled neighbors rather than directly conquering them. They don't really need farmlands. Just leave the farming to the farmers. They just want the goods. And just as John Green would say, the Mongols are an exception. It is also important to point out that the Xiongnu, like many other steppe confederacies, are heterogeneous. Recent studies revealed that they were ethnically and genetically diverse, and they often have mixed heritage. Even historian Sima Qian claimed that the Xiongnu shared common ancestry with the Chinese, and that they were the descendants of the rulers of the Xia dynasty by the name Cun Wei. But it is unlikely that he could acquire reliable information from such a distant past. This probably imagined kinship is most likely a product of the politics of Sima Qian's time, but it is something I will discuss next time. Various steppe tribes also had a lot of interaction between each other: intermarriage, alliance, war, and so on. Some of the notable ones during that time period were the Donghu, Wusun, and Yuezhi. In fact, during this time, the Xiongnu had peaceful relationship with the Yuezhi, and Toman's son and heir apparent, Modu, was living among the Yuezhi as political hostage. With such high-profile hostage in hand, you would imagine that the Xiongnu would never attack the Yuezhi, right? Wrong! That's exactly the reason why they are attacking. Toman actually had a younger son by a new favorite wife, who he was very fond of. And this is part of his scheme to manipulate the Yuezhi to get rid of Modu for him, so his younger son can become the new heir. The scheme almost worked, but Modu managed to escape by stealing a good horse. When he returned home, Toman was disappointed, but he was also impressed by Modu's hardiness, so he put Modu in charge of a 10,000-strong cavalry force. By any measure, having your father plot your death is a messed up experience. But Modu is not the gentle snowflake who would fall into a mopey depression. He is the kind of guy who would get even. So he made some whistling arrows and used them to train his army to be completely obedient. He told his warriors that they must shoot at whatever his whistling arrows strike, or they will be cut down. At first, he started with some easy tests. He brought his men to a hunting trip, and whenever some of them failed to shoot at the target of his whistling arrows, as promised, he would cut them down. Then the test started to get progressively more extreme. Next, he shot his whistling arrow at his best horse. Some of them hesitated and failed to shoot at the horse, so they were executed. Later on, he picked another difficult target. This time, it was his favorite wife. Again, some of them hesitated, and they were executed. But by now, most of his men had learned their lesson. If they wanted to live, don't think, just shoot. Then, the next target he presented them was his father's finest horse. And this time, every single one of them shot at the target without hesitation. Satisfied by their complete obedience, finally, Modu carried out the final phase of his plan. He invited his father to a hunting trip, and in the middle of the hunt, he aimed his whistling arrow at him and let it loose. With the death of his father, Modu returned to camp and eradicated all of his oppositions. His stepmother was executed, his younger brother executed, his father's loyalists all executed. And so in the year 209 BCE, he became the new San Yu. But the Xiongnu was still small and weak at the time, and the big dog in the playground was the Donghu. Hearing that Modu had killed his own father and became the new San Yu, they decided to send an envoy to pay him a visit. "Ooh, nice horse! This is another one of your father's fine horses, eh? Since he is dead now, can we have it?" Modu's ministers were offended by the request, but Modu gave the horse to them anyway. Then, thinking that Modu was a chump, the Donghu goons decided to go a step further and ask for his wife. Despite much protest by his ministers, again he granted the request. Well, since he was a total pushover, they thought, they might as well ask for more. This time, they asked for a stretch of wasteland between their borders. By now, the ministers have learned to see the pattern, so some of them just agreed to give it away. "But no! Land is the basis of the nation," Modu said. "Why should I give it away?" And he executed his ministers who were willing to give up the land. Modu was as unpredictable as he was tough. he immediately circulated an order throughout his domain, and whoever was too slow to join his assault on the Donghu will be executed. So, with the swift mobilization of his army, Modu surprised the Donghu and crushed them. After this victory, he then turned west and attacked the Yuezi, defeating them. Riding on this wave of victories, Modu then turned his attention southwards. By this time, General Meng Tian had already died. He and Qin Shi Huang's crown prince, Fu Su, were victims of Qin palace intrigue. Soon after, the Qin dynasty was also overthrown by popular uprising, and China was in turmoil as various warlords such as Liu Bang and Xiang Yu contended for supremacy. So Modu easily reclaimed the land the Xiongnu had lost. As Modu conquered and absorbed more surrounding tribes, the Xiongnu Empire grew into a formidable force. Meanwhile, down south, Liu Bang won his power struggle against Xiang Yu with the assistance of his general Han Xing, and he established the Han dynasty in 202 BCE. To be honest, it was really Han Xing who won the war for him. And Han Xing became so powerful, Liu Bang got worried about his growing influence. But luck was always on Liu Bang's side. The discovery of Han Xing harboring a fugitive gave Liu Bang the excuse to demote him and get rid of him from the political scene. Eventually, this political spat will culminate into Han Xing's execution in 196 BCE. The point I'm trying to make here is that as the Xiongnu's are descending upon them and a war was looming, Liu Bang had just decommissioned his best general. Not very smart. Instead, what Liu Bang did was relocate a minor king to the north to defend against the Xiongnu, and by some strange coincidence, he was also named Han Xing. It is usually quite rare for Chinese to have the same name since there are so many characters to choose from. But just to be clear, this Han Xing is not Liu Bang's general who went by the same name. Interestingly, this guy seemed to be really eager to accept his new assignment. He wanted to be sent as close as possible to the front line, so his request was granted. In 201 BCE, Modu besieged the city King Han Xing was stationed in, so Liu Bang sent a force to relieve him. But then, he discovered that Han Xing was negotiating peace with the Xiongnu without his imperial approval, so he saw it as a conspiracy. Fearing punishment from the emperor, Han Xing actually defected to the Xiongnu and turned against Liu Bang. Enraged by this turn of events, Liu Bang personally led an army against the turncoat. He easily crushed the combined forces of Han Xing and Xiongnu and made the king flee into Xiongnu territory. But some of Han Xing's men remained and they reorganized their army. Supported by a detachment of 10,000 Xiongnu cavalrymen sent by Modu, they attacked Liu Bang's force, but they were easily routed. But then they reformed again and attacked again, constantly harassing the Han forces. This happened quite a few times until the winter came and most of Liu Bang's army was frostbitten. Liu Bang knew that he shouldn't let the war drag on. He needed to finish it quickly. By luck, he received news that Modu himself was stationed in a nearby city, so he sent out his scout to spy on Modu's army. They returned with news that Modu only had old and weak Xiongnu soldiers stationed there. This news delighted Liu Bang, but his minister, Lou Jing, was immediately alarmed. This doesn't make sense, he thought. During war, the opposing sides always put up a strong front. The fact that Modu's men looked weak could indicate a trap. As Liu Bang hesitated, Modu left the city. Furious at this lost opportunity, Liu Bang jailed Lou Jing and quickly pursued Modu with his small force, ahead of his main force of 320,000 strong army. And it didn't take long until he realized that his minister was right all along. Liu Bang was soon surrounded at Baiteng by Modu's 400,000 strong army, and he had no way of getting reinforcement. So Liu Bang was trapped. After 7 days of encirclement, food started to run low. Everything looked bleak for Liu Bang. But if you know anything about this man, then you would know that he is prodigiously shameless, and there is no method of survival beneath him. So he sent a secret envoy to bribe Modu's wife, and with her urging, Modu relaxed his defenses, so Liu Bang used the opportunity to break out of the encirclement. Thus, that's how the historically important but factually disappointing Battle of Baiteng ended. When he returned, Liu Bang released Lou Jing and personally apologized to him before promoting him to a marquis. He then asked Lou Jing how he should deal with the Xiongnu. The Han Empire had just recovered from a devastating civil war, and the people were exhausted. So Lou Jing suggested to use a long-term peaceful mean to culturally convert them by marriage alliances. This policy is known as Heqing. So they were able to negotiate a peace treaty, and as part of the deal, the Han Empire will have to send periodical tributes in the form of silk, wine, other goods, and brides for their leaders. Or they will risk a large-scale invasion. Liu Bang wanted to give away his eldest daughter to Modu, but due to his wife's objection, he lied to them and sent a distant relative instead. Nevertheless, with this treaty, Modu won the opening round in the first conflict between the Xiongnu and Han. Fueled by this tribute, the Xiongnu Empire eventually grew to a size larger than Alexander the Great's own empire. But this uneasy relationship will eventually spill into a proper war a few decades later in a centuries-long conflict called the Han-Xiongnu War. So on the next episode, we are going to jump a few decades ahead to the time of Emperor Han Wudi, when the Han Empire had grown strong enough to challenge the mighty Xiongnu Empire. So subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss that episode. And here is a warm thank you to our latest supporter on Patreon, Tri Tong. If you would like to suggest and vote on future topics, then be a bro and join us on Patreon. Until next time, stay cool, my bros.